Hope everyone's doing well this morning and enjoying the morning after the 4th of July. The question has come up about this car a number of times, the 2020 Tesla Model S Long Range Plus with an EPA rating of 402 miles. And people are wondering, does this car actually go 402 miles on a single charge? And the short answer to that question is that no, you shouldn't try to get 402 miles out of this car. You really should expect to get between 250 and maybe 300 miles on a single charge, in moderate weather, meaning, you know, anything over above 50 degrees. And the reason why is kind of complicated, but if you drive electric cars, or if you've heard anything about them, you'll know you're never going to take a car, an EV, all the way from 100% of a charge all the way down to 0% to where you're basically running on fumes and you're about to die. The battery's about to die and you're about to be stranded in the middle of nowhere with a dead battery. And with an EV, it's not a good idea to charge the battery to 100%, hardly ever. Unless you're driving a car with something called an LFP battery, and most electric cars don't have that kind of battery. Some of them do, including some Teslas, but the majority of electric cars don't have that kind of a battery. And so as a result, you should not be topping them off at 100% on a habitual basis. You should be topping them off at about 90% of their range, generally speaking, and then running them down to about, call it 15%. So you're using like the middle 75% of your range. And in this car, based on the trips we've taken with it, that means you're going to get between 250 and maybe 300 miles of range if you run it from 90% all the way down to 15%, as you would do when you leave out in the morning and just run it until it's kind of blinking at you and telling you you better pull over and charge. So case in point, we left out yesterday morning at 8 a.m. from Eastern Pennsylvania, from the Bethlehem area where we live now, and we drove it up to Newport, Rhode Island, to spend that afternoon with some friends and enjoy the fireworks and so on and so forth. And after leaving out at 8 in the morning with the battery charged up to 90%, we were able to get 4 hours down the road before we had to pull over and make our first rest stop. So we got all the way, at Bethlehem, you jump on Interstate 78, headed east, go through New York City on the George Washington Bridge, and then jump on Interstate 95, headed north. And we got all the way to the exit. It's like exit 3, where you got to jump off of 95 onto Route 138, heading in towards Newport. And that was at 12 noon. So we got, call it 3.5 hours down the road, because I think we left like a little bit after 8 and then took a couple of pit stops on the way there. And so in about 3.5 hours, we got about 250 miles down the road before we had to stop and charge. And that's leaving with a 90% topped off battery and driving pretty aggressively. And so that means, again, we got about 250 miles out of a charge in terms of practical range. And if you wanted to stretch it out a little bit and maybe drive a little bit slower, and if you wanted to top it off all the way at 100% before leaving out on your road trip, which you can do from time to time, just not on a habitual basis, you could probably get closer to 270, maybe 300 miles. Again, if you're taking it easy and not driving aggressively, and if you start at 100% and take it all the way down to 15%, you could go even down to 10% if you wanted to. Some people take it down into single digits before they stop and charge, but it's not the best thing for the battery. The battery doesn't really like to be charged above 90%, and it doesn't really like to be discharged down below about 10%. So playing it safe in terms of the battery, and again, driving the way a normal person would, meaning you're keeping up with traffic, you're going between about 65 and 80 miles an hour, and maybe you got a lot of traffic. You got to work your way through. Again, the headline is you're going to get at least 250 miles, and maybe closer to 300 on your first leg of the day. And again, if you've got kids, if you're traveling with a bunch of people, you're not sitting in the car for 4 hours anyway, 3.5 or 4 hours anyway. You're stopping closer to every 60 to 90 minutes, maybe every 2 hours, to take pit stops and do what you got to do, and then get back on the road. So again, most of the time you're not going to be sitting still in a car for 3.5, 4 hours anyway. But the point with this car is that you can. And then, oh, by the way, when you do stop to charge it at a Tesla charging station, in this car can charge, can add, and we saw it yesterday, it can add about 150 miles of additional range in about 15 minutes of charging after that first 3.5, 4 hour leg when you first set off in the morning. And so that means, again, in a 15-minute break, maybe you're stopping for a quick lunch and then getting back on the road, you've just added another 150 miles of range, which means you're going about another 2 hours before you got to stop a second time to charge. You don't generally want to add, you don't generally want to charge it all the way back up to 90% when you're at a charging break, because it takes a lot longer to go from 50 to 80 or 50 to 90 than it does to go from 10 to 50%, if that makes sense. The first 150 miles you add to the car, they go on really quickly, and then it starts to slow down in terms of the charging. But keep in mind, we were sharing a circuit with some other Tesla. Most Tesla charging stations, or as they call them, superchargers, have, let's call it 8 charging stalls. You can charge 8 cars there at the same time. And those 8 cars are sharing either 2 transformers, meaning 2 circuits, or maybe they're sharing 4 transformers. And so you're kind of forced to double up with some other car and share the juice. And so even if it's a 250 kilowatt, meaning a high output charging station, you might only get half of that juice because you got to share it with some other car. You might only get a quarter of it if you're sharing it with 3 other cars. And even so, even in less than ideal conditions, this car added a solid 150 miles of range in 15 minutes of charging. And so those 2 facts, the fact that you can get about 3.5 hours or 4 hours of driving on your first leg of the day when you leave out in the morning, and then the fact that you can get another 150 miles added in 15 minutes of charging, means this is basically the perfect road trip car. And it will allow you to do road trips of basically indefinite length, or unlimited length. You could do a 1,000-mile day in this car. If you had to do it solo, meaning just with a single driver, you could. It's not going to be pleasant because you're going to be driving for 16 hours, and you're going to be charging probably 3 times. You're going to do 4 separate 4-hour legs with 3 charging breaks between them. And so that's not the kind of thing you want to do if you can avoid it. But you could do it. We've done a 1,000-mile day before, and it is not a pleasant experience. You obviously can't do it if you're driving commercially, because your workday is only 14 hours, of which you could only be driving 11 hours. But we're talking a road trip, road tripping recreationally. And in this car, again, a 1,000-mile day is entirely feasible. And if you're sharing it, if you're splitting the driving with another driver, it's entirely pleasant. And oh, by the way, it's entirely safe, because most of the time you got the autopilot switched on and the car is doing the driving for you, and really all you're doing is supervising. And so those 2 things, again, the very, very long range and the fact that the car charges so damn fast make this essentially the perfect road trip car. The only wild card is the fact that in cold weather, you are going to lose about a quarter, maybe a third of your range, maybe more depending how cold it is, because of the fact that the car is spending a lot of energy. It's using a lot of energy to keep that battery warm, and it's using a lot of energy to keep the cabin warm so you don't freeze to death and keep your windshield defrosted. But and so yeah, you're not going to go 250 or 300 miles on a single charge in cold weather. You're going to go maybe 160, 180, maybe 200 miles in cold weather. But you're still going to be adding that 150 miles in 15 minutes when you stop and pull over to charge. So for that reason, again, this is basically the perfect road trip car. And you're arriving after 1,000 miles on the road, not completely strung out and angry and tired and exhausted. You're arriving relatively well rested because the car is doing the vast majority of the driving for you with just the basic autopilot. You don't need the so-called enhanced autopilot, the EAP, because that's a $6,000 option. You don't need to pay $6,000 for the enhanced autopilot, and you definitely don't need to pay $15,000 for the full self-driving, the FSD package, which is what it costs in the year 2023. Because that thing will take you door to door, and it'll drive you through like city streets, and it'll make turns for you at the intersections. You don't need the car to do all that for you. You just need it to do the majority of the driving when you're on the highway. And the basic autopilot does that. Now there is a long-range version of the newer, the refreshed Model S. We're not really interested in it because it's a lot more expensive than if you buy a 3-year-old version like this one is. This one here was just over 50K. It was like 52,000 because it was like the end of the quarter and Tesla was trying to get them all off the books, trying to move them all so they could hit a record of like close to 500,000 cars delivered in 90 days. But yeah, a 3-year-old Model S Long Range Plus is all the car you need. You don't need the brand new Model S, which is like an $80,000 car. And oh, by the way, when they refreshed it in 2021, you know, they changed up the interior a lot, and not in all positive ways. Like they took this screen, this nice big 17-inch screen, which is very, very detailed. Gives you an extremely detailed map. It almost looks like you're looking at a paper map because of how detailed it is. And they rotated it from portrait mode to landscape mode, and it just kind of felt like the map got a lot smaller when they did that. And then they took the steering wheel and they replaced it with something called a steering yoke, like as if you're flying a 747, a jumbo jet. And everybody hated it, and they got so much backlash that they ended up switching back or offering you the option of going with a conventional steering wheel instead of the yoke. Maybe 6 months ago, they brought the steering wheel back. But again, you don't need the newest Model S. You just need the 3-year-old 2020 Model S Long Range Plus. And that, again, in our minds, is the ultimate road trip car. And it solves completely the two major problems that our previous Tesla had, which is why we had to get rid of it. And those were the extreme lack of cruising range. It was rated for 268 miles, and we never, ever, in 50,000 miles of driving it, got more. We never saw 200 miles of cruising range. We were getting more like 150 to maybe 175. And then when we pulled over, it took like 45 minutes, between like 40 and 50 minutes to charge back up so we could get back on the road. And And so it took like any road trip of any considerable amount of length, and it added like 40 or 50% to the drive time. Because the fact that you're stopping every 2 hours, maybe every 2.5 hours, for like 40 minutes or longer to charge it back up so you could get back on the road. And this car, again, completely solves those problems. So to anybody who's not sure about getting the Model S Long Range Plus, this car absolutely lives up to the hype. And you're not going to get 400 miles in a charge, but you're never going to need to drive 400 miles in a straight line without stopping. At least if you're middle age, if you know what I'm talking about. Or if you have kids. You're going to be taking a lot of pit stops anyway. And so for the kind of driving that most people do, for the kind of driving that we do, 250 to 300 miles on your first leg of the day is all the driving, is all the range you're ever going to need. And then again, you're stopping, you're charging for 15 minutes, getting another 150 miles, getting back on the road, going another 2 hours, stopping for another 15 minutes. You could do that all day and night if you wanted to. And so for that reason, we could not recommend this car more highly. And we looked at a lot of different Teslas, and you know, the Model Y, which is the most popular car on the planet right now. The Model Y didn't really work for us because it's starting with like a maximum theoretical range of 330, and you take like 60-75% of that, and you're only going about, you know, 200, maybe 220 before you got to stop and charge that thing. It does charge equally fast to how this thing charges, but it's not going to give you, again, that nice long 250 to 300 mile range on your first leg of the day the way this one does. And this one just feels like it drives a little bit better. It's lower to the road. You know, it feels like a lot more of a missile than the Model Y does. The Model Y is a little bit taller. You might even say top heavy. I mean, it still handles great, but this thing is just a lot more lower to the ground, and it just feels like it handles a little better. All right, well, thanks everyone. Hope you have a pleasant day, and we'll talk to you later. Again, if you drive the way we do, like where it's customary or habitual that you're going to be going, you know, a couple hundred, 300, 400, 500 miles in a day, like we said, leaving out from the Bethlehem area in the morning, driving 4 hours, 4.5 hours. You know, we spent the afternoon in Newport, and then shot up to Boston, Mass for dinner with some relatives, and then got back on the road and drove halfway home late last night. It's the perfect car for that kind of a day. Or if you're driving cross country, as we also tend to do. Again, 1,000-mile day in this thing is not remotely out of the question. All right, well, thanks everyone. Have a great day, and we will talk to you later.